Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled The Journey of Brazilian Startups into the U.S. Market. Before we get started on today's presentation, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. For those of you that may have questions about any of today's topics, we invite you to type them into the Q&A widget on your screen at any time. We will try our best to answer all questions at the end of the presentation, time permitting. However, if we do not get to all of your questions today, we will be sure to follow up with you via email. If you experience any technical difficulties with the webinar platform, please refresh your browser or see the webcast help guide on your screen, which is designated with a question mark icon. The recorded version of this presentation will be sent to those that registered post-webinar. A copy of today's slides are available to download in the resource list widget. And as a final note, a short survey will appear on your screen at the end of today's program. We would appreciate it if you provided us with feedback on today's webinar to help us improve our webinars in the future. And now I will hand it over to Pedro.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to have you here. Thank you all for attending. This webinar will be focused on the journey of Brazilian startups into the US market, which is a hot topic in the moment. So I will start with the introduction. I am Pedro Fragoso Pires, a foreign legal consultant with Foley & Lardner. As a member of Foley's Business Law Group, I represent and advise U.S. and foreign companies doing business in Brazil and Latin America, as well as Brazilian companies doing business in the U.S. I will be moderating this webinar. Today, we have a very selected and qualified group of speakers and panelists. We have Lisa Workman. Lisa is a partner with Matos Filho. She's a tax lawyer with expertise in technology law and focuses her practice on consulting in the technology entertainment sector. We also have Dave Canteros. Dave is a partner with Foley & Lardner. He's the co-chair of Foley's Technology Industry Group and a member of the Private Equity and Venture Capital and Transaction and Security Group. He represents venture capital and private equity funds, as well as publicly and privately held corporations in the emerging technology and life science industry. We also have Carolina Strobel. Carolina, or Carol, is the operating partner of Redpoint Venture, one of the most recognized tech venture capital funds in Brazil. She's the co-founder of Cubo, the largest entrepreneurial and technology hub in Latin America. She's a former digital transformation executive and a seasoned corporate lawyer, from legal advice for venture capital, private equity, and M&A deals. She's committed to helping foster innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship in Latin America. And last but not least, we have Marcelo Zucker. Marcelo is the Chief Operating Officer of DGB US. He has provided software solutions to the professional services industry for more than 2 decades. DGB currently has 7 employees, being 7 in the US, and has recently raised $5 million to fuel its US expansion. So here is our agenda for today. We're gonna do a brief introduction of Foley & Lardner. Then Lisa is gonna introduce Matos Filho. Then we're gonna have Lisa and Dave cover structures for foreign companies with US presence. So Lisa is gonna cover the Brazil aspect of it, and Dave is gonna cover the US aspect of it. And then we're gonna have a roundtable discussion with Redpoint, represented by Carol, and DGB, representing from Marcelo. So let's get started with a brief introduction of Foley & Lardner. Foley was founded in 1842. It's a 175-year-old law firm. We have 1,100 attorneys, and we have 21 offices across the US and 3 international offices: Mexico City, Brussels, and Tokyo. Those are our areas of practice. We are a full-service law firm, and we have more than 60 areas of practice. So indeed, it's a full-service law firm. Those are our recognitions by notable guides such as Chambers USA, Best Lawyers in America, US News Best Lawyers in Mexico, and so forth. Poly is very committed to the tech startup space. We have a great platform, as I mentioned, 1,100 attorneys divided in 24 offices. So we have a great network. We have an active deal network when we can connect the major players of the industry. We also support accelerators and founders. And finally, we have alternative fee arrangements like fees deferral for startups. So without a further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Lisa Workman to introduce Matos Filho. Lisa, the microphone is all yours.
Thank you, Pedro. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. So thanks all of you for being present. Matos Filho is a one-stop shop for our clients. It's a full-service law firm. We have over 30 practice areas, and despite being a 28-year-old law firm, it's actually the biggest or one of the biggest law firms in Brazil. We understand the legal challenges and create intelligent and innovative solutions for our clients, being people our biggest asset. So we have over 1,300 professionals today with the firm. And just bringing some recognitions regarding the technology area specifically. So we're Band 1 in technology by Chambers. We are considered a leading law firm for technology, startups, and innovation, according to Leaders League. And we have offices in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Brasília, Campinas, New York, and London. And regarding the technology industry, we have an industry approach. And by that, I mean that we have all practice areas working together and having a holistic view of the industry and helping our clients as a business partner and from a wide perspective. So we work with a multidisciplinary approach, providing our clients the legal solutions. So entering here, the specific theme of our webinar today is the startup and investment ecosystem in Brazil. So I think that the first note that I would like to make is that definitely the entrepreneur is the key to the startup ecosystem. And one of the biggest difficulties that is faced by them is precisely obtaining resources to finance their projects. And that is in light of the high degree of risk and the lack of guarantees involved. And specifically in light of those risks, as we will see later on today in the next panels, several investors opt to not invest directly in Brazil, shifting the investment flow to Cayman or Delaware. What we see is that the alternative to Cayman is specifically regarding the investor decision of not having U.S. tax residency. I think Dave will explore that further later on. But what we have seen lately is that it's definitely an investor-driven decision on where the startup or where the financing shall come from. So what we have currently in Brazil regarding angel investment, which I think is an instrument that is used to foster this innovation activities, and it's fundamental for the financing of companies with high growth potential and that have a risk associated to them, tends to create a difficulty for the entrepreneur and tends to lead such entrepreneurs to actually looking for investment outside of Brazil. So I think this is definitely the key of why we see so many Brazilian startups actually looking to the foreign market as a source of investment. So what we have currently in Brazil is a very embryonic situation regarding the angel investment. Specifically, with regard to a tax aspect is we have a treatment that the income from capital contributions by angel investors is subject to income tax at source based on regressive rates according to the term of investment contracts that vary from 22.5% to 15%, depending on the term. And I think that the most important aspect of this is that currently in Brazil, we have a dividend exemption. So it's definitely unattractive from a tax perspective to follow through the rules that we have from angel investment here, since you'll have a more prejudicial tax regime. So what we see is that I think that the message that we wanted to convey here is that definitely we think that Brazil has a huge potential as we see several startups rising from Brazil, as is the case of DGB, which we will see later on. But at the same time, we do not have the necessary legislative structure to make the country a viable place for investors to actually invest directly. So the risks involved for angel investors, and specifically labor and tax, which at the end of the day end up being the most representative risks involved in doing business in Brazil, tend to surpass the interests of investors effectively coming to Brazil and investing directly here. So I think that we can definitely start with our panelists, which will be able to contribute a lot. I'll pass the word on to Dave, who will be exploring the structures for foreign companies with U.S. presence and explaining to us a little bit the timing and the residency issue with regard to setting up in the U.S.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it. What I'm going to talk about is if there's a decision that you want to enter the U.S. market, how do we do that? Do we set up an entity? And if we do set up an entity, what type of entity? Who owns the entity? So the first point is that I want to flag that there's more considerations than just setting up the entity mechanically. How do you do it? There's going to be tax implications if you set up a legal entity. So you need to understand what those are before you do it. Then there's a timing consideration. When do I set up the legal entity? So with that, I think it's good to talk with your advisors once you decide you want to enter the U.S. market as to how you do it, when you do it. And then if you're going to do it, there's different structures that we're going to touch upon for purposes of this discussion. So let's get into some of the structures. So the first structure that we'll talk about is just simply setting up a U.S. entity as a subsidiary of your current entity. Assuming you have an entity currently in Brazil, then it would be that particular entity that would create a subsidiary in the U.S. So very easy to do in the U.S. You can do it yourself by going on LegalZoom. You can have an attorney do it for you. You can have an accountant do it for you. So setting up an entity in the U.S. is very easy. We can touch upon that a little bit. By setting up a legal entity in the U.S., that entity, to the extent that there's U.S. sourced income, there's business that entity is doing in the U.S., will be paying a tax in the U.S. At a rate of 21% for income taxes. So again, something to work through, with your advisors as to timing and the like. The next entity that you would set up, we call a brother-sister structure. So again, the prior entity was you have an entity, current entity, it creates a wholly owned subsidiary. A brother-sister structure is slightly different, where you are setting up a U.S. entity, but the owner of that U.S. entity is not your current entity. It's actually the shareholder of the current entity. So hypothetically, if you have three founders that own an entity in Brazil, and they now want to go ahead and enter the U.S. market, those three founders could set up a U.S. entity. So now those three founders own two separate entities, Brazilian entity and U.S. entity. In the short term, that's an easy thing to do, and there's really no issues with that. But it's not workable from a long-term firm standpoint, if in fact you want to grow your company. That's because ultimately, if you grow your company and if you take investment dollars in, those investors will have to reside in one of those two entities. And let's hypothetically say it's a U.S. entity. So now we have a disalignment of interest between the two entities because you have different shareholders in the different entities, and it really becomes unworkable. So long-term solution is to have a wholly owned subsidiary and not to go the brother-sister route. The next one, it's a term we'll talk about it sort of in other sections of this presentation, is flip. So the flip is, it's the opposite of having a U.S. subsidiary. You actually have a U.S. parent. So ultimately what happens is, assuming you have an entity in Brazil, the shareholders in that entity in Brazil will simply set up a new U.S. entity and they'll exchange their shares in the Brazilian entity for that new U.S. entity. So when all is said and done, the shareholders reside up top and they own a new U.S. entity, which is the parent entity for the current Brazilian entity. So all the equity is owned up top at the U.S. entity, and you have a subsidiary now, which is the current Brazilian entity. It's called the flip because typically the way it's done is the Brazilian entity would set up the U.S. entity and then flip it on top the way I just described. So this structure is the most common structure if, in fact, you are going to be doing business in the U.S. and if you're going to be raising money from investors in the U.S. Because U.S. investors typically will want to invest in a U.S. company, and they're going to want to invest oftentimes in a Delaware corporation, which we'll touch upon. So you'll end up with this structure if, in fact, you enter the U.S. market, you raise U.S. dollars, but you may not, because that may be your plan. But what happens if you're unable to raise U.S. dollars, or you raise funds from someone that's a larger investor that's not in the U.S., and they're not going to want to put money into a U.S. They're going to want to put money into maybe a Cayman entity. So because there's uncertainty, until you actually close your financing and raise U.S. dollars, the general recommendation is wait. Wait, don't do the flip yet. Keep your current entity in Brazil as parent company where folks own their shares. If you feel as though you should have an entity in the U.S. because you're starting to do business in the U.S., and tax reasons, it makes sense, go ahead and set up an entity. Set it up as a subsidiary. And then wait. If that ultimately makes sense, if you find those investors and they want to invest in the U.S. entity, then do the flip. But don't do it initially, because if you end up not raising money in the U.S., you've just wasted that time and energy creating a U.S. entity on top that you're going to have to undo down the road. So the fortunate thing is that these things can be done very quickly. So you have the luxury of waiting and seeing into what really drives your decision. And likely is going to be investors that would drive the decision. So we generally take a wait and see approach on them. So the next direction we're going to touch upon is, let's say they have three founders, but they haven't yet set up a Brazilian entity, and they say, you know what, we're going to want to enter the U.S. market. You can go ahead and just set up an entity in the U.S. and be owned by three founders in Brazil with no parent entity that's a Brazilian entity. That's perfectly fine to do. But again, I would say take a wait-and-see approach, because it makes sense to do that if, in fact, you're going to be, doing business in the U.S. and maybe raising dollars in the U.S. But if neither of those come to fruition, then it doesn't make sense to go ahead and take that step. So something you can do, but again, we would recommend a wait-and-see approach on that. We're going to touch upon briefly this branch office concept, because you'll hear about it, which is, I want to do business in the U.S., but I don't want to set up a legal entity in the U.S., but I want to have a presence. So you can set what's called a branch office by, certain filings that you'll make, that you'll declare a presence in the U.S. for purposes of, regulatory purposes and filing purposes. We really don't recommend this because the tax rate for branch offices is 35%, whereas for corporate it's the low 20s, 21%. So it's not tax efficient. Another issue is that because you don't have a legal entity, a corporation, LLC, that's set up in the U.S., then any U.S. sourced income, ultimately the tax filer is going to have to be the ultimate entity. which is going to be, in this case, likely the Brazilian entity, set up a branch office. So that Brazilian entity is going to have to be filing tax returns in the U.S., which is not desirable. Ideally, if you're doing business in the U.S., you'd like to have a legal entity that is a tax filer. And that's the entity that's going to be dealing with the U.S. Internal Revenue Service. Because if the IRS feels as though insufficient taxes have been, or there's an audit or the like, you want that to be trapped in the U.S. entity, and you don't want party responding to this to be the Brazilian entity that maybe has lots of other businesses outside of the U.S. that are now subject to, to the purview of the IRS. So branch office puts you in that situation, which we don't recommend. This slide simply, we want to talk about, if you do set up an entity, a U.S. subsidiary or a U.S. parent, you have two different entities now, Brazilian entity, U.S. entity. It's important to treat these entities and respect them as separate legal entities for two reasons. Number one, from a liability standpoint, you want to have what's called the protection of corporate bail, so that in the situation where the U.S. entity is a subsidiary, if the U.S. entity gets sued, you want that lawsuit to be trapped at the U.S. entity level, and you don't want them coming up being able to sue the Brazilian entity. And as long as you have appropriate corporate formalities in place, then you'll be able to have that level of protection. The other is just from a tax filing standpoint. Again, in order to sort of separate out tax filings, who's responsible, and also for other tax purposes, you have to have an arm's length transaction between the two entities. If not, then the taxing authorities can intervene and suggest that you're using the assets of the other entity without paying fair value for it, or paying a licensing fee, which should have been paid. Therefore, we're going to deem that that's due and payable, and they're going to assess penalties on you. So, recognizing the separate corporate entities is important from a liability standpoint to tax purposes. I'm going to touch briefly upon whether you should set up a corporation or a limited liability company, because those are the two principal choices in the U.S. for companies. So there's efficiencies with when you set up a limited liability company that it's effectively disregarded from a tax standpoint. So the taxes, if hypothetically the Brazilian entity sets up a limited liability company as a subsidiary, that LLC does not pay taxes on income. There's just one level of tax, and it's paid at the owner of the limited liability company, which in this case would be the Brazilian company. So that's great in that there's just one level of tax, as opposed to a corporation as a subsidiary. There's corporate income tax, and then if you distribute the funds up to the Brazilian parent, there's another level of tax that you pay in Brazil. That's two separate taxes versus one with an LLC. So an LLC is certainly more efficient from a tax. The problem with a limited liability company is that a limited liability company, again, because the entity doesn't pay taxes, the taxes are paid by the owner. In this case would be the Brazilian entity. And this comes back to the concern that we raised earlier, which is that preference would be that you have the legal entity in the U.S., which is a corporation that's dealing with the IRS and paying taxes on U.S. sourced income, and you're not having the Brazilian entity that has to file tax returns in the U.S. all of a sudden, or the owners filing tax returns in the U.S., now being subject to each of the Internal Revenue Service. So in balance, for that reason, we generally recommend that you set up a corporation when you want to do business in the United States, and not a limited liability company. And ultimately, that corporation, if you do raise U.S. dollars, would sit on top of the LLC after the flip that we talked about. So with that, I'm going to touch briefly upon setting up an entity, in the U.S. Typically, we set up corporations in Delaware. And why do we choose Delaware with only 1% of the U.S. population resides in Delaware? Well, we do it because from a historical perspective, companies were set up in Delaware because there were significant tax incentives early on. And because of that, because there was a big rush to Delaware, Delaware's developed a body of law that companies understand, directors understand, whereas other states don't have the depth of the body of the law that Delaware has. So investors are generally comfortable the Delaware entity doesn't understand them. They're predictable. So that's why you ultimately end up with, I would say 9 out of 10 times with a Delaware entity. Setting up the entity is really easy. It's just a filing that you do at the Secretary of State's office, and within 24 hours, you can have the entity set up. And then once you have the entity set up, you can get a tax ID number so that you can pay taxes in the entity would pay taxes in the U.S. And with those two things, you can then open a bank account, and it can be up and running within a couple of days as far as having an entity set up in the U.S., having a bank account set up in the U.S. And again, the recommendation is you start to do business in the U.S., haven't raised money, go ahead and do this as a subsidiary, and then that whole thing can flip on top very quickly once you identify investors who want to do a capital raise. With corporations in the U.S., there's boards of directors, there's officers, there's shareholders, there's different roles that they all play. And so you'll have to designate, who serves as the board that runs the company. And then the officers that do the day-to-day management. So those are things that you'll decide. But the good news is that they don't have to be U.S. persons. So the entire board can be non-U.S. Shareholders don't have to be U.S. The officers don't have to be U.S. So again, really easy to set up these entities in the U.S. With setting up an entity, you're going to have people that are performing services for the entity. So this is an important point that I want to touch on very briefly, which is, are the people that are performing services going to be employees or independent contractors? And in the U.S., oftentimes you'd want to have independent contractors early on because independent contractors have to pay their own taxes. There's no withholding obligations, which there is if you have employees. But in the U.S., if somebody should be classified as an employee, and every state has their own test on that, they need to be characterized as an employee. And you need to do tax withholdings for them, and you need to pay them minimum wage in the U.S. In the federal minimum wage is, I believe, $7.25 right now, but wherever that employee resides and where they're working out of, you now need to recognize the state minimum wage. And it can vary from state to state. Texas is $7.25, which matches the federal minimum wage, but states like Massachusetts, where I'm out of, it's $12.25, California $15. So for a startup with very little funds, trying to have employees in the U.S., it could be costly for you. But if you don't abide by the U.S. wage laws and the minimum wage laws, there can be consequences to the company if that person ultimately sues. There are penalties and fines. So it's another important consideration. Just to make sure you get proper advice on that. So that's what we touched on. Then the final point with just a couple minutes that I have left is, with U.S. investors, they're going to want to understand, especially technology companies coming out of non-U.S. entities, they're going to want to understand, what's the intellectual property strategy? Is there intellectual property? And I'm not an intellectual property lawyer, but sort of the basics that I can share with you is that there's different choices between patents, copyrights, trademarks, and the like. So it's important to work with an advisor to understand what we have for IP and are taking the necessary steps to protect that IP. Because investors are going to want to see that you're going to want to see that those assets, which are ultimately going to be potentially significant assets in the ability of the company to raise additional capital down the road or get sold. Those are things they want to make sure that have been properly protected. And also, investors are going to want to make sure that whatever IP is owned by the company, and you'll see many cases where the founders have developed intellectual property, and the founders want to keep that intellectual property for themselves and then license it to the company. That doesn't really float for U.S. investors. U.S. investors want those founders to put the IP in the company so that the company owns the IP 100%. So that's, sometimes an education process with founders to understand that U.S. investors will require that. And they're going to want to see that there's proper documentation. So again, just wanted to touch upon intellectual property as an important consideration, in this whole process of setting up entities, coming to the U.S., raising dollars. But there's a much deeper discussion that should be had on that front, which, we're happy to make introductions to many of our IP attorneys. We have, I think, over 450 attorneys. So with that, I want to thank you for the time and pass over the
Thank you, Dave, for this great presentation. Thanks, Lisa, for covering also the Brazil aspects of it. Now we are moving to the second session of our webinar, which is a roundtable with Carolina and Marcelo. There are some important and relevant issues that to be considered in this journey. So everyone is invited to join the discussion. For the audience, we have a Q&A session at the end of this program. And of course, Lisa and Dave, they're welcome to make questions to Carolina and Marcelo. But I would start addressing some issues that I would like to hear from Carolina first. And the first one, Carolina, I think it's a very important issue and interest for everyone who is involved in this sector, is what do you see from an investor perspective as important, and what are the issues that you consider before making an investment in a startup? If we can cover a little bit of cap table, option pool, whatever you think it's important, we would love to hear from you about that.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me today. Good afternoon to all of you. My name is Carolina Strobel, and I am a partner at Redpoint Ventures. So let me introduce you to Redpoint Ventures. We are a venture capital firm investing in Latin American startups, mainly tech, or just tech, but with flavor. So we do prop tech, we do health tech, we do fintech, and we have a very experienced team in Brazil, a very close partnership with the Valley, with the Silicon Valley, eVentures and Redpoint, that these two firms make, they are partners in Redpoint eVentures in Brazil. And what we do is we secure the capital, the talent, and the growth so that the company can succeed even further. We are on since 2012. We invest across seed, Series A, Series B. So this is our nice point of investment. We manage over $300 million. We have over 40 companies in our portfolio. I don't know if you're showing, Pedro, a little bit of our portfolio, but if you can see that, that's the slide that I brought. We have some companies such as Creditas, Gympass, Minuto Seguros, Olist, Papify, Rappi, Resultados Digitais. So we basically have around 30% to 40% of the unicorns that we have in Brazil. They are in our portfolio. So also, as part of our mission to support the Brazilian ecosystem, we co-founded Cubo. Cubo is the second largest innovation hub in the world, and it is based in São Paulo, where we are also headquartered. So if you have a chance, please come and visit us and get to know Cubo a little more. We're changing a little bit the business model so that everybody can still have the sort of serendipity of meeting each other somehow. Well, talking about investments, I was considering everything that David was saying, Lisa was saying, and the feeling I have is that from an investor standpoint, we care very much about the exit. So when we talk about tax structures, we're generally looking into the exit to make sure that we can have the best exit to all stakeholders. So, of course, the day-to-day operations are important to the companies, but please take my comments as for companies which operations are held in Brazil, which is generally the kind of companies that we invest, okay? So for those companies, what we believe as investors that it's very important to be in a country where the legislation is entrepreneur and investor friendly, where the rights and obligations can be executed, where we have good lawyers, and where tax structures can benefit everyone. So, of course, it is easy to invest in a country that you already know, that you're used to. That means that, investing in the US or having a company in the US is easier for us to stomach. We are used to it. So it is easy to set up companies in Brazil nowadays. This is not the issue any longer. It used to be, so it used to take a very long time to set up a company in Brazil. And even the lawyers would have what we would call shelf companies ready to sell, because it would take a very long time for us to set one up. That's not the case any longer. But as Lisa was saying, we have labor and tax matters that normally points the investor towards a different direction, which is investing normally through US and other countries such as Cayman and even Ontario. So the investors will normally look into a proper handle of the company's assets and constitution, besides making sure that everybody can benefit from this tax structure. We try to foresee the outcome, and we begin a little bit begin to be a little bit of a specialist in the art of creating more value through the structure that we have in the company. So normally what we have is an operational company in Brazil. And LLC in Delaware, David, please do not kill me. We don't have, we have LLCs there because normally the operations are not happening there. And we have LP in Cayman. That's what we normally do. I think it's important for the companies, the Brazilian companies, to understand that if you are under the Simples, which is a simple tax, optional taxation regime that would allow the unification of the unified collection of municipal, state, and federal taxes, you cannot have a company, a holding company outside of Brazil, or you will not be able to use this tax benefit. So basically, we only flip a company, and that's using David's, again, comments. We only flip a company into Delaware when this company is a little more meaty. So it's like a Series A. We traditionally don't do this in a seed stage because it's expensive. It would cost around $50K, $50K to $100K in dollars for lawyers to do that. So we would be very careful to do this transaction. But we normally would have a loan in Brazil, and we would convert into equity when we flip this company. And what we normally do is to double flip. We would go to Cayman. So we would have an LP in Cayman, an LLC in Delaware, and the Brazilian company, which can be either an SA, a corporation, or a limited company, limitada. So that's what we normally do. And we do that, and we bring everybody all together. So all the angels we have, and sometimes the companies have several angels or friends and family and fools that invested in the company in the early times. We bring them all together, up the scale, until we are all together. Because then when the investors are in the same holding company, we can align interests and have a better exit. So that's what we normally do to produce more value to the companies.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Marcelo, I think that we're all very interested in learning your experience with DGB. Can you give us some background on that? The main issues that you challenged and you faced during the internationalization process. What would you recommend for those Brazilian startups that want to go the same path and become international?
So, first of all, Pedro, thanks for inviting us. After everything that was said, I'm very glad that it seems that we took the right path, right? So, first of all, DGB was founded in Brazil, and we were very glad to be invited by Kubo and join Kubo since from the beginning, almost from the beginning of DGB. It helped us a lot. We learned a lot with Kubo, not only about all the serendipity that actually happens there, helping us to acquire clients and also get to know a lot of investors. But it was also from there that we got our seed round. And as we got the seed round that was $1 million, the first thing we need to accomplish was exactly doing the flip. So we had an operational company in Brazil, a limited liability in Brazil, and we flipped it here to US, opening our holding company, let's put it like that, exactly in Delaware, right? And here in Delaware, just as a comment, is a corporation. So the reason why we built that structure was exactly because it was driven, that decision was driven by the investors, right? It makes much more sense. It was a US fund together with an angel investor in Brazil, Paulo Veras, that helped us with the seed round. And then when things evolved a little bit more and we did a Series Bridge with that same fund here in US, and the main focus was to help us do our expansion here to US. So what we did is, again, we used the same structure that we already have created. And just as it was commented here, so we never create any structure before the investments, right? So we did the flip when we got the investment, and we opened the operational company here exactly in the moment where we secured the Series Bridge, and we started acquiring talents. And that was exactly when I joined the company to help us to do the US expansion, starting here from Florida to the US. Today we have here our office here in Florida as a starting point, and we also have an office in Denver. We already have 8 people here in our US team. DGB has 72 people globally. We were born as a global company since day one, because one very important thing, Pedro, is the problem we solve, right? So we are a company that the reason why we exist is to solve a very complex problem, which is the integrations. And basically what we're doing is we're making that problem a very simple task to be achieved. And how we're doing it is basically we have our platform. It's a low-code platform that facilitates how you build your integration. That's all very interesting, but it comes with a very important concept. Not only we have the platform, but we also bring our expertise and a methodology to make those integrations much simpler to be accomplished with our engineering and with some concepts like our reusable capsules and a very intuitive to use interface, and all of that with a very interesting and innovative business model that charges in a different model, in a SaaS model, right? In a more turnkey platform where we basically have our cost per pipelines and completely different from the industry. We don't charge per users or consumption. We don't have setup fees or upfront investments. So when we bring all those concepts here to US, basically what we see is the solutions that were competing with us in Brazil were actually solutions on the majority here from US. The US market is much more mature, and it was very important for us to compete not only with some of the major players here in their own background and learn from a more mature environment, but more than that, we know that we can achieve a much higher market and a bigger market, right? When it comes, when you compare to what we can achieve in Brazil. Brazil is a huge market, and we are putting a lot of effort to be ahead of everything that is going on in terms of technology. And one way to do that is also to be here in the US market. So this can help us be stronger in our Brazilian operation and Latin America, but also to start our global operations, looking for a market that is not only more mature in terms of adopting technology, but also more mature in terms of helping startups like ours to grow and receive investments, and the next series that we for sure will need to accomplish to fulfill our task to be a global company in terms of how we facilitate integrations around the globe.
Perfect, Marcelo. Thank you very much. Before we move to the Q&A section, I would like to ask Dave and Lisa, they have any questions for Marcelo or Carol? We still have 5 minutes before the Q&A session. Otherwise, we're going to move it. We have 3 questions so far for the Q&A session.
Pedro, I think we could go with the Q&A section, and then I could make my questions after that. Let's get the audience first.
Great.
Okay, so the first question is for Dave. Dave, I wanted to know how easy, difficult it is to change U.S. status. An LLC that files to become a Corp S, how easy would it be to convert it back?
To convert an LLC to a Corp, or a Corp to an LLC?
A Corp to an LLC and the way back, I think it will be interesting as well.
So it's interesting. It's easy to do, especially in Delaware. There's a simple filing called a certificate of conversion that you file, and you can convert your entity from an LLC to a Corp, or a Corp to an LLC. The challenge, though, is again, tax seems to be sort of this constant theme with companies. If you have an entity, a corporation that has become profitable and has retained earnings, and you then want to turn it into an LLC, there could be a tax hit at that point in time. You have to recognize those earnings and pay the tax on them at the time of the conversion. So, easy to do from a pure sort of administrative corporate standpoint. It's a simple filing you do with Delaware, and it can be done in one day. But you need to assess what are the tax implications of doing that before you do that. So always rely on your advisors. Yep.
Thank you. Carolina, which methodology do you use to evaluate technologies or intellectual property of their startups that you have interest to invest?
Well, it's always interesting to receive this question. It's a great question. But the thing is, what we use is basically we understand how much money this company needs. So when we select a company, we look into three things. We look into the thesis and whether their thesis, the problem they're trying to solve, is actually something that we are looking into as well and that we can add value. We look into the people who are in this company and whether these people are able to escalate or to make sure that this solution will reach the maximum success. We're looking into these three items. We would define how much money this company needs. And basically what we would do, we get around of how much this company needs. It's not rocket science. It's not something that we use, KPIs or comparables. In Brazil, it's very much different. Sometimes we don't have, not only in Brazil, but in the industry of venture capital as well. Sometimes you don't have the comparables. So we try at our best to have the comparables. We try at our best to use KPIs if the company is operational already. But sometimes you just don't have all that. So sometimes you have to go and understand what the company is doing, how much the company needs to survive for a sort of a seed stage, and then move forward in the next series, depending on what happens next.
Thanks, Carol. We have a third question here. It's not addressed to anyone, but I think it will be a question for Lisa. Lisa, when Brazilian startups look for funding from abroad, for instance, the US, our Brazilian currency control is still a problem?
Well, I think that what we have today is that Brazilian currency would actually not be considered a problem just because the Brazilian currency is so devaluated with regard to the dollar. So I think that Brazilian assets would definitely be viewed as being very cheap for a foreign investor at this point in time. With regard to the closed foreign exchange market that we have, I think it's important for us to always keep in mind that in Brazil, we do have a strict control of foreign exchange. And so we have a limited amount of possibilities on how the funds will actually enter Brazil. That's to say that it will essentially either be considered a loan or a capital increase. And so the way the investment is done might actually be impacted by the foreign exchange control that we have. I don't think that the currency, in fact, here now is a big issue, because we are at a point in time in which the Brazilian currency is very devaluated compared to the dollar. I don't know if anyone else wants to make a point here.
I think there was a time where, the central bank would not cooperate, or it's not that it wouldn't cooperate, but would have so many restrictions. It was very hard, but that was like 20 years ago. That's not the case any longer.
No. So I think that we're done with all of the Q&As from the audience.
No, actually,
I think we have one more,
actually,
right?
we have another question here. Now we have one more. And the question is for Carolina. Carolina, are you looking into biotech as future opportunities? How mature do you think biotech investors are in Brazil?
That's an excellent question again. So what I think is that, for instance, when we're talking about the areas where we invest or where venture capital has been investing traditionally in Brazil, biotech has always been behind. That's the feeling I have. So fintech is overpopulated in Brazil. And, we have our bets in Red Point Ventures, but it might be a little overpopulated. We look into health tech, we look into prop tech, and biotech is still getting there. I think that with the excess liquidity that we are seeing, not only in the world and also in Brazil, but also the fact that we are having very low interest rates, this will help very much to have more biotechs being invested. The issue is that normally biotech requires a lot of R&D until it is ready to escalate. So that's something that an investor would look carefully into it. So it depends on the products that this biotech would have, basically.
Okay, we still have questions coming in. So we have time, Lisa. If you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and make those two questions, the last questions, two other questions. And then if we have time, we can address other issues. So two questions for Carolina again. Carolina, how much tech-related has a company need to be in order to get invested by a fund like yours? Suppose a consulting firm that has some tech services and that does count on technology to operate globally, but it's actually not a tech company.
The definition of tech company in Brazil is being very flexible, right? So we have been seeing IPOs going on that, basically are brought up as tech, and they are not tech by nature. And we do not invest in companies that are only tech by nature, but they have a very strong tech component that will help this company to escalate. Because that's where we can help the company. We are, we're used to tech. We are tech, somehow we are tech experts, and we can help the company better if it's within this segment. Let's put it this way.
Thanks, Carolina. The very last question. Why in Brazil, the VCs or private equities on the majority only look for the middle markets and more established companies? The funding here in Brazil is very limited to angels and seeds. For bigger series, we are forced to move to other countries like the US, where the money is available.
Well, I think it's changing. I think, and I see your point, and I have been seeing this in the market, in the venture capital market in Brazil for a while, but I think it's moving into a different direction. And I can see that, larger Series A deals that we have been seeing before. And I think that what we're missing, actually, it's not exactly the funding, but the solutions with the right people eager to execute and escalate. I believe that certain regions of Brazil are not very well positioned to receive funds. So we are very centered in the Southeast region, and we look very much into the Southeast region, besides some points that we have like Recife, Florianópolis, but they're small hubs that we're looking to. So there is a large continent for us to look into still, but I think it's changing. The liquidity is increasing, and what we're finding right now is the missing point for us is to get companies that have the right people to execute the solutions, and that the solution makes sense, aligns with our thesis. This is what we're missing, from my point of view.
And Carol, I think that this actually is it's a really great question for us, since we're hitting the end of our webinar here, just because it really exposes the difficulties of getting angel investment in Brazil and seed investment, and how effectively the investments are being focused on more middle markets and more established. And like you said, when companies are more meaty or more mature, that they're effectively able to do this flip and have the investors enter with the investment from abroad. So I think that this is it's a really interesting point of view, because in fact, making seed investment and angel investment currently in Brazil does present a significant amount of risk as well. And so this is this one of the reasons that you see that private equities and VCs are actually looking to more established companies?
Yeah, there is, as you know, we were saying, Lisa, there is a chain of investment. So we look into angel investment before, then venture capital, and then you go to private equity. That's what we do. And unicorns are generally brought up by, venture capitalists, and then they are the private equities basically hunt the unicorns. The unicorns are almost there, so that the private equity can hunt them. So in this chain, what we're seeing right now, and what we have been seeing traditionally, is that venture capital is increasing, private equity is increasing by LAVCA numbers. This year, you can see that in Brazil, the venture capital investment in Brazil last year was an all-time record, but we don't see that in angel investing. We don't have the tax benefit, and you were saying that before, and I was in the Anjos do Brasil. I'm a board member at Anjos do Brasil today in the morning, and we were looking into the numbers of last year, and within the numbers that we're seeing right now, we're basically beginning to get more investments, but still it's a very, very small amount. We need to invest more, definitely, in the angel group within the chain of entrepreneurship, so that we can have more unicorns, so that we can have more exits, successful exits, in my point of view. And one thing that we need to work with is the government to get, and I trust Matos Filho does an excellent job doing that. And we have, councils working with the government to provide for more benefits to angel investing. That would be significant, an inflection point in the chain that, from my perspective.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And we're very much open to helping the ecosystem with that initiative. And I think it's really important for us to be able to capture all of these amounts here in Brazil. So we do need legislative change. Well, I think that we're ending here. We're getting to our final minutes. I just wanted to thank everyone and pass the word on to Pedro.
Thank you, Lisa. I would like to thank everyone again for participating in this interesting webinar. Particular Matos Filho for co-hosting this event with us and for co-sponsoring this event with us. I'd like to thank very much Marcelo and Carolina for such a great presentations. It's always very valuable, to learn from you, from your experiences. And of course, I'd like to thank Claire, Christina, and Joe for all the support that they gave to us during this webinar. And again, thanks for the audience, for everything. And we hope to see you again in our next event.